She sat alone on the train platform, rain soaking her dress, mascara bleeding into her tears, abandoned by the man who'd promised her a new life, who took one look at her and walked away. Not a soul stepped forward, until a stranger in a dark coat reached out his hand. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The rain didn't let up. It dripped from the edge of the awning in slow, deliberate beats, each drop carving its rhythm into the wood below like a metronome of shame. Margaret sat stiff-backed on the bench, her hands still curled tightly around the handle of her valise, knuckles white despite the cold. She didn't move, not out of stubbornness, but because to move meant to feel. And feeling at that moment would mean breaking open. The world around her felt impossibly still. The town of Ashford, with its shuttered storefronts and crooked signposts, seemed to turn away from her, as if even the buildings themselves recoiled in polite avoidance. A woman alone at the depot wasn't an unusual sight in the West. But a woman like Margaret, broad-shouldered, heavy-set, soaked to the bone and freshly humiliated, was the kind of sight no one wanted to acknowledge. People pretended not to see suffering when it made them uncomfortable, and Margaret's kind of pain was too familiar, too human to be easily dismissed. She breathed shallowly, her corset damp and biting into her ribs. Her cheeks still burned from the encounter, the words Harvey had said looping endlessly in her mind. You could have at least told the truth, as though the shape of her body had been a lie, as though her softness was a crime against expectation. Yet everything in her letters had been honest. Her favorite hymns, her pie recipes, her longing for silence filled not with loneliness, but with warmth. What else had he wanted? A porcelain doll? The whistle of the departing freight train echoed off the hills like a hollow warning. She turned her head slowly, watching it disappear into the fog. It had a destination, a purpose. She, on the other hand, was unclaimed freight, forgotten cargo, no ticket back, nowhere to go. Somewhere deep inside her, a protest rose, small, stubborn, and trembling. He didn't even ask my name. Not once. After weeks of letters and promises and imagined futures, he hadn't cared enough to ask who she was. He'd seen her face, her size, and decided everything else didn't matter. That hurt in a place deeper than pride. It struck at the root of something tender, something sacred. And still, she sat. The rain painted her hair darker, her skirt heavier. But she would not crumble. Not here, not now, not where he left her. The lantern above the depot door flickered in the wind, casting broken shadows across the wet planks. Margaret sat unmoving, her shawl drawn tight across her chest, the wool soaked through and clinging like second skin. Her fingers, still clenched around her valise, had gone numb long ago, but she kept holding on, because letting go felt too much like surrender. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, cutting through the hush of the deserted platform. Not the brusque stride of a rancher or the hurried step of a traveler. No, this gait carried weariness and purpose in equal measure. A man not just walking, but arriving. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his, steady, tired, searching. He didn't flinch the way others did. He didn't let his gaze dart away, embarrassed by her presence. He simply looked, his expression etched with the kind of empathy that doesn't ask for permission. His hat dripped rain, and his coat clung to his shoulders, worn thin at the seams. Yet his bearing had gravity, like someone who'd learned not to speak unless he meant it. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The question should have been simple, even forgettable. But there was weight in how he said it. No presumption, no pity, only an invitation to answer honestly. Margaret wanted to wave him off, to avoid the sting of another man's evaluation. But the words slipped out, cracked and low, Just waiting for nothing, I suppose. He didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he crouched beside her with the quiet patience of someone who understood the language of grief. His knees creaked, but he said nothing about the cold or the lateness of the hour. He simply met her eyes, grounding her in place without so much as a touch. "I'm Dr. Samuel Hart," he said softly. "Came into town for a child with fever. Funny thing, thought that was my only reason for stopping here." His smile was faint, but it lived in his voice more than his mouth. Margaret's laugh came out sharp. "Trust me, I'm not part of anyone's reason." He studied her for a moment. Not her body, not her wet clothes or the traces of tears on her cheek. Just her. "That man who walked away from you, he was blind," he said, voice low but firm. Her throat closed around a dozen retorts. She managed only one. "You don't know anything about me." "No," he agreed. "But I'd like to, if you'll let me." Then came the pause, the pivot. "There's a fire still going at the boarding house. Hot soup, an empty room. You don't have to stay out here proving something to the dark." For the first time that day, something inside her shifted. Not hope. Hope had been exhausted. But recognition. His hand, when it extended toward her, didn't tremble. He wasn't rescuing her. He was offering her a choice. And that was something she hadn't been given in a very long time. The boarding house creaked with the soft weight of memory. Its floorboards whispered underfoot, and the faint scent of cedar mixed with the sharp sweetness of dried orange peel tucked into a chipped ceramic bowl by the front door. Margaret grew used to the rhythm of this new life not through grand gestures or declarations, but in the quiet routines that filled each hour like thread pulled tight through cloth. Mornings began with the kettle whistling in the kitchen and the muffled rustle of Samuel's footsteps down the stairs. He never spoke before she poured the tea, always letting her choose whether to start the day in silence or conversation. That choice, small as it seemed, mattered. It gave her back a piece of herself that had long been flattened under judgment and dismissal. The extra teacup he placed each morning wasn't just hospitality. It was presence. A quiet declaration that she had been expected and wanted. Word of her pies spread quickly. Her crusts were thick, buttery, unapologetic, the cherry filling bold and slightly tart, never cloying. She brought the first batch to the general store in a woven basket lined with an old hand towel. By week's end, the shopkeeper asked if she could bring more, especially the butterscotch custard. Children began to call her Miss Margaret, not with mockery but affection. One little boy handed her a broken toy horse and said, "You fix things." She took it home and did just that. At dusk, she often sat by the window with a needle and thread, working on her quilt. The scraps weren't beautiful, not in a store-bought way, but they each had a history. A corner from a baby's blanket, a square from a worn church pew cushion, an edge of her own apron. The stitches were firm and clean, even when her hands ached. With every line of thread, she wasn't just sewing cloth. She was stitching herself back into the fabric of a world that had once cast her out. Samuel never hovered. But when he passed by the porch where she read aloud to a few neighborhood girls or helped mend a neighbor's sleeve, his glance would linger just long enough. Not possessive, not admiring in the way men looked at bodies, but respectful, seeing. On the evenings they sat together, the silence between them never demanded filling. It breathed. And she realized, with slow astonishment, that silence didn't always mean absence. Sometimes it meant trust. When she handed him the scarf, her fingers brushed his, briefly, but with intention. In his eyes, she didn't see surprise. She saw recognition. That night, as he left her on the porch with only the creak of the swing and the smell of fresh pine from his coat lingering in the air, Margaret finally understood something simple but powerful. She was no longer merely staying. She was beginning. The sky above Ashford wore its summer best, deep navy velvet scattered with early stars, wrapped in the lingering scent of wild mint and sawdust. Lanterns swung from ropes strung between oak trees, casting warm halos over the town square. Children darted between hay bales with sticky fingers and flushed cheeks. Old men leaned against fences, tapping their boots to the rhythm of the fiddle, while women in cotton dresses turned pies and secrets in equal measure. At the far end of the clearing, a quilt contest was pinned to a wooden fence. Among the entries, patterned flags, heirlooms, and samplers, hung a single patchwork piece stitched from remnants of a dozen quiet lives. Margaret's quilt. The stitching was careful but not perfect, the fabric humble. Yet it carried something none of the others did. A soul. A life reclaimed, one square at a time. A small white ribbon fluttered beneath it. Second place, but the kind of second that meant more than winning ever could. She stood now beneath the canopy of string lights, the quilt draped across her shoulders like armor that had never needed to shine to be strong. Her feet felt rooted in both fear and anticipation as she watched Samuel step into the center of the dance square. He wore no tie, just a clean shirt, sleeves rolled, the same quiet assurance in his stance that he brought to every room, and every silence between them. For a moment, Margaret stood on the edge of the light, not because she doubted him, but because some part of her still remembered what it meant to be looked at and laughed at, to be the wrong shape in a world with sharp corners. Then she saw it, how the crowd around them didn't jeer or judge, but slowly stepped back, not to isolate her, but to honor her. They made space, not as if they were witnessing a spectacle, but something sacred. The hush wasn't awkward. It was reverent. He extended his hand. She walked to him. And as they began to sway, not with precision, but with truth, Margaret felt the last of the weight she'd carried for so long begin to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into belonging. Her body moved not as something to be hidden, but as something whole. The music didn't mask her presence. It revealed it. Later, as they stood outside the boarding house, quiet between them like a shared breath, she looked up into the lantern's glow and whispered, "You changed my life." But Samuel only smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't seek credit. "No," he said. "You just needed someone to remind you of the truth." And under that soft light, quilt slipping slightly from her shoulder, Margaret wasn't transformed. She was revealed.